Perfect. Okay. Still technologically capable. Excellent. Um, right. Yeah. So when Jack asked me over the summer to do a brewery tour, I had a bit of a sit back and a think, and I'd actually done a tour in 2020, I think, during lockdown, but it was quite a short tour, and as I vaguely remember, it was fairly well oiled after one of our more sociable sessions. But I was keen to do something in a bit more sort of a bit more detailed and a bit more around my processes and steps, to brewing. Um, Most of them, I guess, a bit like everyone else's, are built up of lots of advice shared by brewers over the years, over the sort of 10 years since I took up brewing again. And definitely one of the aspects of the hobby that I appreciate most is just the absolute openness and generosity of brewers, whether it be through the club or forums or even the books and internet resources and so on. So I wanted to do almost like a sharing session on the ones that I found most useful. So I guess if people can walk away from tonight, even if they only take away a couple of things that they want to question about their own processes or glean something that is of use process-wise, then I'll be very happy. So yeah, so how do we go on to the next slide here? Not that technical. Oh, there we go. So I thought I'd cover rather unoriginally a bit of brewing history, bit of background about my brewing, and then basically from recipe formulation to beer in a glass, I've tried to pick out bits that I feel are the most important for my brewing, that either make it better or easy. There are definitely some caveats. It's not going to be comprehensive. I've just literally picked what I thought are the interesting bits. So there will be lots of gaps. I've done the presentation in the form of, it's mainly slides and photos, but we can absolutely explore the brewery and, no questions off limits, however nosy, it's all good. But I've kept it in this format only because I have to pedal very hard to make our internet connection work. We are still on ADSL, and there is no way I'm risking doing this live, as it were. But this isn't pre-recorded. I am actually relatively live at the moment. I think it'd be good if people could ask questions as we go along, so that they're asked at the point that we're talking about, whatever technique or step it is. Don't feel in any way that it's going to spoil what little flow I have going. And in fact, I've asked Steve if I miss anyone on the chat or whatever, he's going to cough loudly or wave or give me a virtual punch so that I don't miss people. Thank you in advance, Steve. Perfect coughing.
If I do this,
but yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. But yeah, everyone, please just butt in as we go along, whether it be to compare it with your own processes or ask for a bit more detail where I've skipped over something, or less detail if I'm waffling. So yes, I think that pretty much covers what we'll go through. The picture there of the whole brewery, most of which I think people have seen, probably through my Zoom background, most of which isn't AI generated. My brewing, so I enjoy, there's probably about a dozen styles that I enjoy brewing, and have done since I picked up brewing about 10 years ago again. I love brewing English styles, but in particular English IPA, which I think is probably one of the most underrated styles around. I just love that. Oh, it's always about hop and malt balance, isn't it? But I love the intensity of both those flavors, or the moderation in both of those flavors in that style. I just think are just lovely. One of my favorites. I, like a lot of folk, enjoy brewing American styles, in particular West Coast. I brew very little hazies, and very occasionally I do, but mainly it's West Coast styles, so they're all clear. And I do love American and English barley wines. And then finally, there's a few Czech and German styles that I really enjoy brewing. In particular, Maibock or Hellersbock, which I really love. again, there's probably quite a lot of similarity, I guess, between that and the balance in an English IPA and a West Coast IPA. They all have a decent chunk of malt character, and all fairly hoppy, even the Maibock. So those would be my favorites. Generally, I'd say I enjoy brewing higher ABV beers. I've added one in there at 2.2% just so that I don't look too dodgy. But and I'm probably going well against the grain here at the moment, given where the rest of the world seems to be going. But these days, I like to have a couple of pints before dinner rather than several that I might have had in my youth. And so, yes, it's nice if they have a decent, strong flavour to them and so on. So, yeah, that's I guess my brewing in a bag. Part of the fun of brewing, I guess, is the wide range of skills that you need to be a sort of jack of all trades in biology, engineering, chemistry, and all that sort of stuff. And I definitely enjoy, you can see, label making. That's quite a bit of fun. So I quite enjoy having to think about a beer and linking it to either a memory of a place or mainly places, actually, in my past. And then I'll stick with that name for all the iterations of that particular version. But yeah, quite enjoy that. I tend to focus. No, I'd probably fixate. I think on a style is probably a better description, until I feel that I've sort of proved to myself I've gotten to the flavour I was hoping to get to, or the beer that I was hoping to get to. As everyone knows, I am quite a long way away from the nearest club, so I have to use competitions as a measure of whether I'm getting there in that style or not, for better or for worse. But I quite like the way that they're also quite a well-rounded measure of how you're doing as a brewer, because they include packaging and, in my case, needing to ship across the continent, sometimes in hot weather and so on. So yes, not the worst measure you could have. I guess at that point, improving the beer over multiple iterations, well, involves multiple iterations. I think I've brewed double IPAs in the last 6 months. I think I've brewed 4 or 5 of them. And at that point, it's probably no longer a beer I'm quite so fond of after that many versions of it, especially something like double IPA in the fridge. But we'll see. So far, they've lasted. In terms of my brewing background, I did a little bit whilst I was at university in Cardiff. I think about 1995, I got bought for a birthday one of those bags. I don't know whether they had, I think they had DME in them actually, and you just added tap water into them and you hung them on the back of the door, and they were like a colostomy bag, I guess. They would blow up over the period of 2 weeks. And the idea was that you would try that at the end of the 2 weeks to survive drinking it. And it really was pretty rancid, actually, you know. So I quite quickly then turned to liquid malt extract kits. I think it was Muntons used to do loads of them at that point, and plastic fermenters. And without being aware of it, I guess I started churning out imperial stouts using wine yeast to see how strong we could get them. That was quite good fun, but it was all pretty fusel heavy, and as a result, yeah, probably left me with lots of mood swings that I probably didn't need at that point. It was fairly heavy duty, some of them. And then I didn't brew again for about 10 years. That was probably enough to put me off, actually, some of that stuff. We moved to Chamonix. Oh, there we go. We moved to Chamonix in the Alps in 2012, and I really missed English ales. So in 2015, I bought some more plastic fermenters and lots of little plastic barrels. So here's me 10 years ago, looking 30 years younger, looking very happy with my brown solar pump that I've got going there. I was very chuffed with that. That was an infancy of all-in-one. And then over the years, I gradually sort of moved on to 3-vessel kit, buying sort of slightly bigger 50-litre kettles and mash tuns, so I could brew bigger beers all in one without always being right at the lid of that sort of funny, what were they, sort of repurposed tea urns. And along the way, moved up and acquired whilst I was running the 3-vessel system, I had a rims system, which is very good with a nice sort of sight glass in. That was quite fun. And my dad, who is a cryogenicist and electrical engineer, became the most overqualified person ever to help his son build a PID box. So there's a little PID controller on the wall there that he helped me build, which is lovely. And then what? Yeah, and then so at this point, I've ended up taking it to pieces and put it back together in various different houses that we've moved into numerous times, and including 18 months in a shipping container. Didn't actually brew in there, although when I set it up in there, I was hoping that I might be able to, but that proved to be impractical when the heat inside was about 35 degrees in summer and minus 13 in winter. So anyway, that all came out again, and then I moved on to, well, put it all back together again to achieve the dream brewing system. Ken won't be at all surprised here, and have done everything since on this system, which is perfect for 300 ml barley wine batches. Slightly facetious. No, so I've now ended up with 2 main brewing systems. One is already one is in semi-retirement, which and glaring at me on the shelf way too often. So I've still got the 3-vessel kit, bar a couple of modifications. And then I was also lucky enough a few years ago to win a Brewzilla 65 at BrewCon. And so I went over to the dark side and the easier side and brew most of my beers now out of the Brewzilla. And there are pros and cons to both systems, which if people are interested, we can I'll mention a few of them as we go along, but can certainly have a chat about that at some point. Most of the rest of my equipment is a fairly, well, for home brewing anyway, a fairly moderate budget. It's all circa 2017. I've got a stainless conical, SS conical, but it's one of their standard ones from that year. I've got a flat bottomed fermenter as well, which is quite useful for ales. Takes up less space, so I can get around much more easily. And the rest is just converted pots and tea urns and all the usual kind of stuff. I try and avoid plastic these days in anything, well, certainly anything cold side, just because I don't trust it. I like steel. I like to be able to clean stuff properly, and this will definitely be my children's legacy. They'll be happy to discover when they're not in the slightest bit interested in it. So it will definitely be here after me. And then finally, I guess, in terms of my brewing, probably my biggest driver is stability. I need beers to be able to last in kegs in a kegerator for anywhere between 2 and probably 6 months, but maybe even longer actually for those bigger beers. I mentioned an American barley wine earlier, and that will definitely be in the keg for 18 months before I even think about bottling that. And it also needs to survive hot to competitions, and age in bottles as well gracefully. So, and much of my process, I think, I think has ended up reflecting this. So whether it be mash hopping or pomegranate extract or some of the steps I take when doing closed transfers or what have you, I always try and do the longest, cleanest fermentation possible, just to avoid any chances of under attenuation or off flavors. Everything is sort of geared towards making something that's going to be stable. So start from the beginning, I guess. If once I've decided what I'm going to brew, if it's a beer that I've not brewed before, I will go looking for a base recipe. Like all of us, I think I've probably been everywhere for them. These days, I usually stick to the lab wiki or someone like Gordon Strong, who I think is pretty reliable, if a little complicated, but great recipe still. Sometimes it takes a few different tries, especially if I've looked at other sources. Other times, a bit like with the lab wiki and, for instance, Lucas's Midnight Snack American Brown. First time, just an amazing beer, amazing recipe, and you're off. Once I've got that base recipe, then I'll start with the then I'll come back. If I brewed it once, then I'll come back to the software that I've used. I use Beersmith, but they're all fairly much for muchness. And I'll pick up the previous iteration and I'll look to adjust any issues with malt, hops, IBU, attenuation. Obviously, with brewing software, I realize that the numbers are all very approximate for things like IBU and color. But I do think that they're relative if your process is stable. So you can always build on the last iteration so long as your process is stable. So yeah, iterations is definitely the way I like to work. Like all of us, I also keep brew notes. Mine are electronic because my handwriting is pretty terrible and I would be apt to lose anything on paper. But it also means that they're searchable, so I can go searching through, hundreds of literally hundreds of recipes and find issues that I've, and pick out issues that I've had.
When you say electronic, Ian,
Yes.
is that like your own spreadsheet or is that in Beersmith?
I've kept it even simpler than that. So I have, great question, Steve. Anyone would think I'm paying you for this stuff. So I just use the Notes app. I mean, I've rejigged it a bit here, but I just use the Notes app on a Mac. And then when it gets too big, I cut and paste them into Word. Again, still searchable. I just find it simpler and easier just to tap into whilst I'm brewing. Even if I get 5 minutes for a cup of tea, you can sort of tap into a notes thing, what's going on. So I keep most of the information here. Again, I'm sure most folk keep all the essentials. My note starts off life almost as a checklist. So a lot of these where there's numbers, I've got question marks, so it reminds me to do stuff. And I've also got extra things in there. I should have put a blank one in, actually. That was silly. But I've got blank stuff in there to say, remember to turn the pressure cooker on for stuff, to sanitize stuff. So it's got a bunch of reminders in there as well, so I don't miss stuff. I keep a lot. What else would I say about the notes? Yeah, the usual stuff. So I always try and keep brew notes about either what happened on the day I brewed, day I kegged, whatever that I might be worried about. So here I tried to pick an example here where I had things go slightly south. So efficiency was pretty poor, and I was worried that a loose valve had gave me some oxygen ingress, so that then I can go back to it when I tasted the beer and potentially connect off flavors with what I think might have gone if things have gone wrong during the brew day. Yeah, it might be sometimes you open a bag of hops and stick them in when you shouldn't have, when they smell a bit funny. So anything like that I try and note down. I try and note down lots of information on volumes. I'm always trying to get to better levels of predictability and consistency, because that way I find it easier to isolate changes in the finished beer, what the changes were due to. We'll come to that in a second. And then you could say there, keep any water notes, and it's sort of a reminder of what I need to put in. But I'll come back to water in a minute as well. So let me go back. So so that's brew day notes. Malts, I've a fairly simple approach to malts. I always crush everything because that way it's freshest and keeps really well. I mean, some of the stuff, even malts seem to almost keep forever, so long as they're not crushed. I try and keep to the same supplier again for consistency, and especially with specialty malts that have more flavor in them. Hops, probably a bit more complicated. So I always work backwards with hops. I tend to start with especially for RPA beers, I'll start with Whirlpool edition, and I'll work that out on a grams per litre edition. So I might be looking for 8 grams per litre for an IPA, no more really, might be 6 grams per litre for an English IPA. And then I'll work back through 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 30 minutes. And then finally, what is often quite a small bittering edition at 60. I really like layering the hops. to build them up. What have we got? So this would be an example of double IPA recipe that I've been brewing a lot of recently. Relatively simple recipe. There's a chunk of Munich in there, and a little bit of biscuit, because I quite like the malt to be rich in an IPA, but without being caramelly. I think you get enough of that coming through anyway from a big malt bill like this. But then, I think I've got about 8 grams a litre, 8+ grams a litre in the whirlpool here, and then work my way back through 5, 15. Is there any at 30? Not in this one, no, but the layering, I like the layering you get at 5 or 10 minutes. I think the flavors are more complex than you get if you just do, what do they call it? It used to be called bookending, didn't it? Where you just had a bittering addition and then a whirlpool. And we can come back to that recipe if people have got questions.
Ian, just one question,
Sure.
unless it's too long to explain. On that fourth or fifth line, you have your 60-minute addition, but 0 IBUs.
60 minutes, 60 minutes.
Fourth line.
Right. So that's a mash edition. So that's a mash hop, and it was some fairly low alpha old Simcoe leaf, and I just took a shout there. I know the software will indicate IBUs, but for the purpose of this recipe, I mean, 100 grams is quite a lot actually for 26 litres. Normally I'd only use maybe 36 grams. But generally, and I'll come on to mash hopping a bit later, but I tend to pick a lower IBU variety, and I'd probably pretty much discount the IBU addition, especially if it was in leaf form. I think if you use pellets, there's the risk of carryover of bitterness, but with leaf, especially old leaf, you don't get very much. So really my first IBU addition there would be the Flex and the Apollo.
Yeah. Makes sense. Thank you.
So yes, so the hops. And these days I find I'm doing more and more. I really like doing big whirlpool additions, especially of low alpha hops. I think it worked brilliantly in styles like the English IPA and the Maibock. I think the hop flavors you get are richer and smoother than dry hopping. And I think in those styles in particular, obviously it'd be a bit weird dry hopping and one of a Maibock, but certainly for the English IPA, I actually prefer it not dry hopped. I like the richness the whirlpool gives you, and I think you avoid any risk of O2 ingress there, especially if you can't introduce your dry hops through something like a hop bong or something like that, which is probably one of the weaknesses of my system. So I'm a huge fan of big whirlpools.
Do you have a formula for leaving out the dry hop and how much you add into the whirlpool? So you'd add, I don't know, 50% more in the whirlpool than doing a dry hop or something.
I think so. If you take an English IPA, and I'd have to double check my recipes here, I think I'd go for about 6 or 7 grams per litre, which is basically nearly up there with, pretty much up there with what I'm putting in an American IPA. So I think, yes, that's probably 50. I would estimate that's probably 50% more than you would put in. But unlike a dry hop, the flavors are so much richer and smoother, I think, that you can be heavy-handed with a whirlpool, I think, even in those styles.
And you whirlpool at below 80 for
certainly not above. I think I set it, and again we'll come on to that a bit later, but I would set my temperature for sort of 78, so that yes, if it goes over a little bit I hit 80, but by and large I'm under, but it's about 80. In terms of allocating hops, I sort of use the rule that the fresher the hops are, the later in the process I'll use them. So obviously starting with dry hop would be the freshest, and then working back through whirlpool and late additions. By the time, to be honest, I get to the late additions, I mean, some of the hops I use are really quite quite old, to be honest. But so long as I do a lot of, the usual opening the bag and sniffing and rubbing and all the rest of it, some with the hops as well. But so I'm reasonably relaxed at that point. And by the time you get to the mash hopping, I think Scott Janish has even done study or pulled up studies to show that stale hops in the mash will give you more fruity flavors. I've never quite had the courage to put in something that's really cheesy, but they're certainly pretty dry and not smelling very much. Some of the ones I use for mash hopping. So yeah, generally fresher later. I will also do a survivables check. So this is the Yakima studies, and we've talked about them quite a bit in the past. The Yakima studies that show that some hops, the oils in some hops, I call them oils, but the oils in some hops will survive hot side much better than others. So I'll do a quick check to make sure that I'm using, well, more to the point, I'm probably not using stuff like Cascade and Amarillo and let's say Sabro in the hot side. I'll make sure that instead it's Centennial and Idaho 7 and Citra on the hot side, just to make sure that I'm not putting a hop in, a lot of which will then potentially get lost. I also will have a look at what kind of substitutions I've done. So for years, actually, I remember raising this a few times, I've always wondered about the relationship between alpha acids and oil content in hops. So this is I find this quite a bit in my English styles and German or Czech styles. So here's an example of some French hops that I've been using to do Hellesbox and things like that. I will, for instance, I've used quite a lot of Triskel in Whirlpool or late hopping. Now, that's a very low alpha acid hop, and its total oil you can see there is 1.5 mils per 100. If I end up substituting Aramis for it, it's not a million miles away. The IBUs are 3 times that. So I'm using, if I'm not careful, I'll end up using 3 times less, but it's got the same oil content. And I've found that, I was finding that occasionally I wasn't getting the hop flavor that I wanted. And I couldn't work out why, because I was automatically equating alpha acids with the flavor and with the oils and the flavor in the hops. And it doesn't work, if I understand it right, it doesn't work like that. So in this example, I probably wouldn't swap out Aramis, or I'd look for a lower IBU version, or rejig something else. So it's just something to bear in mind if you are substituting hops, is that alpha acid is not always tied to total oil content, which is a better measure of the flavor you're going to get from the hops.
Ian, have you got a spreadsheet with all this information on? Because it could be very handy.
I have got a crude one for this, yes. But I've also found, I was reading the other day, I can't remember where I came across. So after I carefully gathered, well, a bunch together myself, I then found out that I think there is a spreadsheet on, there is an online resource. Where did I see it? Was it Michael Tonsmeyer? And even he might have also linked to something else by Janish. But I think there are online resources that will allow you to do this.
Is it Beer Maverick by any chance? Because I've seen the oil information there before.
I've used them before, but I haven't been looking for this there. I've tended to do it on a bit of an ad hoc basis based on the hops I've been using, rather than looking for a more well-rounded resource for it, which would, of course, be the sensible thing to do. And I also think it probably, from memory, the tie between the sort of, I call them the sort of American hops and the big C hops tends to be closer. Have I found any outliers there, like here? Probably not in the same way as I found for some of the European hops. which can be, yeah, which can be wildly different, the relationship. But it's an interesting little check to do when you are subbing.
You say that, do you mean you can more easily swap in Centennial and Chinook and Columbus because they've got a similar alpha acids to oils ratio?
Exactly. Or certainly I haven't found the outliers yet, but that's, yeah, maybe that's a bit of a silly thing to say actually, because I don't use, I do tend to buy, through the generosity of club members, I do tend to buy sort of, a kilo or so of something at a time. So the variety of hops that I use isn't huge either. So yeah, your mileage will definitely vary there. So it's still worth doing. Scratch what I said there. Definitely worth doing.
Sorry, Ian, another question.
Yeah.
Is it the oil that affects the flavor of the hops? I've always thought hop oils are more about the aroma. Or is there something else in the hop that also affects the flavor?
When I sort of did a little bit of background looking into it, and this was, a year or so ago now, I came away with the impression, choosing my words carefully here, that it was the oils that gave the flavor.
Right.
And it's certainly tied into my experience of, but then equally,
Okay.
I suppose the other thing is, if you're using 3 times the amount of a hop than another, then you've got 3 times the amount of hop matter and any other flavors that's carrying with it. Now, sometimes those are flavors that you maybe are trying to cut back on, like grassy ones, in which case a sub like the one between, there for Aramis for Triskel might be worth trying. But sometimes those other flavors, including the grassy ones, might be what you want in the beer anyway, if that makes sense. Maybe not quite grassy, but sort of herbally grassy. So it's just, I think for me, it's just when you come to do the next iteration, it's just worth looking at. It's just another factor that's worth looking at if you're at the point where you're fine tuning the hops in a recipe. I'll come on to this in a second, but I always try, and my brewing is actually very crude in terms of this kind of form, in terms of recipe, in that I try and minimize absolutely the number of levers I'm pulling. I've got malts, hops, and then probably the mash profile a bit, and I only use a couple of yeasts to keep it. I just try and keep things super simple, because I find trying to identify the changes, I find it difficult enough even with a minimal number of things. And in for the first 5 years of brewing, I was, different yeast each time, different hops, different recipe, different styles. I got to the point where I felt like I was not actually, in some respects, there was no iterations going on at all. I was just hanging all over the shop, which was great fun, but my beers weren't improving because I wasn't doing iterations. So I really, a few years ago, sort of stripped it back and just said, come on, I'll come on to a bit more, but yeah, just try to limit the number of levers that I was pulling with any given recipe.
Thank you.
Right, so make sure I don't forget anything. Memory is fantastic. So I use a hop spider now, which I didn't in my 3 vessel system, and I always find with the spider, and I know this isn't everyone's experience, my experience is I just need to add on 10 IBUs for pretty much any recipe that I pick off the shelf, because I would, and my take on it is because the hops are not moving freely around the kettle like they were with my 3 vessel system, where they were being constantly pumped around all the time and always in solution and moving around. And it's a big spider as well. We'll have a look at it later. It's one of the Malt Miller ones. It's the size of a small waste paper basket. But inevitably, even with that, I find I have to keep stirring it because they just sink to the bottom otherwise. And I also, and this is another tweak which is specific clearly probably only to me in the club, but I also have, and the software does this for me, but I have to adjust my hopping for altitude because water here boils at about 97. So my utilization is going to be lower than you guys in London. Right, so those are probably some of the main checks I do on hops. Then I will have a look at mash profile, and I'll usually adjust this before the yeast, partly because I'm only using a couple of strains of yeast, 2 or 3 strains for yeast. And so I'll make a tweak here for attenuation if I wasn't happy with that. At this point, I might consider God, blimey, caption competition for this photo. I might consider doing an overnight mash. So this is me wrapping up the mash tun here with a kid's sleeping bag. Come in handy one day. And again, I'll cover some of the pros and cons of overnight mashing later because I do a couple of different versions of it. So I'll make it, but at this point is at the recipe formulation, I'll now adjust whatever iteration to make a beer drier or fuller, or and at this point most of my recipes end actually because, like I say, I really am looking for the smallest number of levers to pull with any given beer that I'm trying to get to a point that I'm happy with. I think if I got to the point where, like a brewery, you're brewing, if your hops and malt are relatively fixed and you're brewing week in, week out the same product, then I can imagine putting more attention to yeast strain water. And I definitely have in the past played around with a lot more yeast strains. I know some brewers who focus, for instance, almost exclusively on cask styles, and they'll go into huge they'll try out all sorts of different yeast strains, and I think then when you know your product that well, I think you can get some really surprising results. But I just find that personally, with the variety of styles that I brew and the frequency that I'm brewing, there's always a simpler lever that I think needs pulling first before I get onto that stage. But maybe in 20 years time, I'll have then got on to playing around with different different yeast strains more than I do at the moment. On the point of yeast, so like I said, I went from doing 2-3 years ago, I was doing loads and loads of wet yeast, bringing stuff back from bottles and playing around with all of that, which was good fun. It was quite time consuming, but I decided a few years ago just to sort of try and pare it back and concentrate on consistency. With the liquid, I was finding I was getting a reasonable amount of variety and repitching variability. I mean, effectively, it would behave differently as the pitches went on, as your generations went on. And so it was I just figured I could do with, and occasionally I'd have a starter go south or whatever. Never put it in the beer, but it wasn't, it was a lever that I felt at the time and still do at the moment that I didn't need to be pulling in order to improve a beer. So now I try and use, I'm a big fan of Verdant, love Verdant, and Nottingham. So I'll buy a 500-gram brick and repackage it using a vac pack into roughly what you'd need to do whatever my brew length at the moment is, I guess, maybe 25 liters or so. So I would then repack based on maybe a 6% beer, into the different packs, and then open, maybe sort of partially open as needed. And I've done this and used it for, I've had them then for maybe 3 years, I think, 3 years. And as we know, they're incredibly strong. What I have found is that after about 18 months, you need to up the pitch rate by, how much have I gone up by? 20%. Otherwise, the yeast, I think, it starts to struggle. So I do notice that, but it's still incredibly good value if you can buy a brick and repackage it. I also, at the moment, I'm on S189 for lager yeast. It's not my favorite. I don't think, for me, I don't get that little note of sulfur that I quite like in, especially in German styles. So I'll be trying something different next. But it does enable you to get to know a particular yeast very well. Yeah, very well doing it this way. I think that's probably about it for recipe formulation. So in which case, on to brew day preparation. As I said earlier, I will mill all of my own grains. I find with the all-in-one system, one of the cons with it is definitely sparge speed. So with the 3-vessel, partly due to the broader bottom, and but mainly because you control the outlet and the inlet, I could get a very nice slow sparge going. Whereas with the 3-vessel, I would probably say so half the time my sparge takes about 10 minutes, if that, and then occasionally I'm having to punch holes in the bottom to let it go through, and then sometimes it works fine. So I still feel like I'm getting to grips with sparging on the all-in-one, the all-in-one system, whereas the 3-vessel was the control you had over sparge with that was amazing. And as a consequence, I'm finding my efficiency at the moment is still much more variable than it ever was with the 3-vessel system. Yes, so I will mill anything huskless. I'll definitely go on a finer setting, so wheat and rye, and the smaller grains. Definitely go on a finer setting, or I'll just run them through twice with the other grains. And at this point, I'll also separate out any of the darker grains for mash capping. And there I found I need probably 10% more as well for those if I am mash capping. And then one of the things I always do these days is I put all the crushed grain into an old plastic FV, and I will weigh it and check the total weight against the grains, because several times I've missed my efficiency by enough over the years that I've literally sat there thinking, have I forgotten to put a kilo of this, that, and the other in? So it's a good check to do to make sure you have at least got the same total weight as the recipe requires. At this point, I'll also measure out my mash salts and pop them into the grain. I normally will mill my grains a day or two in advance, so this way I never forget to put the mash salts in. So always do that in advance, and then I measure out and treat water into the FV and the not FV, into the kettle and the hot liquor tank. I use metabisulfate powder, which I like the way you can dose per litre rather than just the Camden tablets. And also, I remember someone once saying something about the binders in Camden tablets as well. And obviously, you do away with that using the powder form. And then I acidify my water now, thanks to Jacques, using the Brewer's Friend calculator, which is absolutely brilliant. I've done it a few different ways, including the other way, which was quite stable, was acid malt, a dose of that. But certainly the Brewer's Friend calculator, if you put your grist in accurately, your grist and all your volumes accurately together with your water chemistry, it will tell you how much, in my case, 75% phosphoric acid to use. And I reckon I'm within a point each time of pH. Absolutely amazing. So yeah, that was definitely a good tip.
Yeah, I've found the same. It tells you the estimated pH, but I find it spot on every time. I've never had it off if you do everything it says.
Yes.
Like get the grist color right and get the liters right and so
Yeah.
on. Yeah.
Yeah. The only time I have found it not to work quite as well is that is when you're mash hopping and you don't want to add the acids immediately. But I'll come to that again in a minute. I'll save that. But yeah, but even then, it's only a couple of points out. It's amazingly accurate. I don't know how they do it. So at this point, let's move on to the mash. So I use a drill stirrer, which is not as good as underletting on three vessel system. That was the ultimate way to dough in without any dough balls or hassle. But it's pretty good and takes some of the arm work out of doughing in. And at this point, I will also either add mash hops, or more and more these days I use ellagic acid through pomegranate extract because, well, basically as insurance for beer stability. So the aim is basically trying to chelate metals, mainly iron and copper, really early in the brewing process, so that they're not reactive and they'll precipitate out in the mash.
Sorry, and could you just spend a couple of moments on this pomegranate thing? I've not come across this before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what you're trying to prevent is this thing called the Fenton reaction, which accelerates oxidation. So and then sort of for everyone, so that's what would give you those sort of stale, papery flavors. It means you get hop aroma loss really quickly. It gives you color darkening and also a haze when you don't want it. And what studies have found is that either using mash hopping at a rate of about 30 grams for a 20-liter batch, so that will give you a 30% reduction in metals, mainly iron, when you come out of the mash. Pomegranate extract, so which is with the active part there is this ellagic acid. Again, they did studies where 90% ellagic acid will give you a 80 to 90% reduction in the metals that are coming out of the mash, which is huge. And it's really important for grists where you have specialty malts, because specialty malts add about up to 6 times more metals than, let's say, something like a Pilsner malt, which I guess is why, for instance, crystal malt oxidation is so noticeable. So yeah, for me, it's for it's so I've ordered some pomegranate extract through the States. It's about, I think I paid something like $20 for a 250 gram bag, and I've ended up getting the 40% ellagic acid, and even then I only use 3 grams for a brew, so it's a tiny amount. It's pennies really for the insurance of getting rid of a whole load of metals out of your mash before they carry on into the finished beer and with the potential to be oxidized. And this
the other possibility is to use Brutan B, which is well, I get mine from Kegland. Does the same thing. It's got the removal of the iron stuff in it. So Brutan B is possibly easier to get than pomegranate extract, because I've never heard of pomegranate extract, so that was a new one for me.
If it's what I'm thinking of, Peter, I think it's there's another, is it punacilic acid, or there's another chemical which is also a very good chelator, slightly better, I think, than pomegranate, but both of them are leagues ahead of mash hopping in terms of this same effect. So, I mean, that said, yeah, I mean, either they're both. I don't know. Certainly pomegranate extract. If you can find it, I didn't look for it in the UK, but the costs, yeah, crikey, even if you had it shipped, it'd be pretty minimal given the amounts you're using. But it seems to me whether any of these options as an insurance against some of those staling flavors.
In a 20-liter batch, I'm using 1.5 grams per batch. So, I got 100 grams here. It's going to last me a while.
Yeah, fair enough.
So, guys, two questions here. First, kind of, I think it's a yes or no. So, if we're saying that the oxidation of the crystal malts, which I'm sure we've all experienced quite a few times, is primarily due to the different metal ions, and they drop out as a result of this pomegranate extract, would that then mean that you can start brewing your IPAs with crystal malt again?
An excellent experiment, Serge. But yeah, potentially
Right.
you've knocked out a whole load of risk. Yeah.
And then I guess the second question is, does it again primarily influence the oxidation in these and the stale flavors, or does it also prevent potential metallic flavors? This one is important to me because every so often, out of nowhere, on a random brew day, I would end up with a beer that tastes metallic at the end of fermentation, etc. Doesn't seem to be dependent on the style, on what I'm doing, etc. Just completely random. So I'm just wondering if it's also potential insurance for that.
So if I remember rightly, Janish is doing it for that as well. So he talked about, I've heard him talk a bit about getting those flavors, especially out of lower ABV stouts. And so that's another reason why he now does it, because yes, it will take that percentage of the iron out of the beer, and therefore, yeah.
That's super interesting. As recently as Saturday, had a couple of stouts, and it was metallic, and quite a few of them. And I always associated that with just the particular amount of roast, but never thought about it coming from actually just malt.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think I need to do some more reading and research, and maybe add another thing to my arsenal.
Yeah, he did. There's an episode of, I'm just trying to think where I first did. There's an episode of Beersmith where he goes into quite a bit of detail about it, and also he goes into a bit of detail about it with Jamil on one of his podcasts, Bruce Strong or something like that. I can't quite remember, but yeah, I think it's an interesting. Yeah, definitely an interesting thing to play about with.
I watched something with Scott Janish, and he also mentioned it prolongs the hop flavor in the beer. So your beer will taste fresher for longer. So it's not just about oxidation of the crystal malt, but it's also about the hop flavor that lasts longer. That's how I know it. And I got some pomegranate powder here in the UK for like 12 pounds for a pack. It's quite easy to find on Amazon. It's pink. And you
Yeah.
pick up, yeah.
And yeah, I think I've got a picture of it. So there you go. And what's the important thing is the amount, the percentage of ellagic acid in it, which you can always, like I said, I mean, I end up putting double in what Janish used with his 90%. And I don't notice any color or flavor or anything like that. And like Peter said, we're talking about amounts that are absolutely minuscule. So, but yeah, my understanding was that oxidation is both the cause of not only those stale papery flavors or in crystal hops, that kind of ultra sweet bonbon type flavor, but oxidation will also cause hop aroma loss and flavor loss, and the color darkening as well. They're all results of oxidation.
I won't lie. I won't lie. I'm so tempted to do a side-by-side IPA with something like 7% crystal.
Yeah, yeah.
And you've noticed a distinct difference, Ian, because your like your English IPAs and my box are super malty. Is that because is that a lot of malt, or is that a little bit of pomegranate?
um, um, I definitely brew them on the strong side. And with my English IPA, there is caramel goes into it. And I mean, here's the thing. I've had, before I started doing this, I definitely would notice, oxidation in beers, especially when I do a 2 keg brew and put 1 keg aside. I don't just, but I'm very wary about, I'm sort of very wary of looking for confirmation bias. I think, like Serge said, there's no two ways about it. You can't beat a decent test of it. I'll tell you one test I think would be really interesting would be also for hazies to use it and see whether it prevents color darkening, because that's, as we've seen, numerous club members have a go with. Color darkening in NEPAs happens. You look at it wrongly in the bloody bottle and the glass, it goes brown. So that would be an interesting one to try.
Would it also have an effect if you dosed it after fermentation in a oxygen-free environment, left it for a bit, then bottled or packaged, whatever's off the top, as a quick test?
So again, and this is, I've used my memory here. Not used to doing this. I'm pretty sure that as well as using it in the mash for all of their beers, one of the times when they tried using these, let's call them chillators, and I think he used the very first version of the product that I think Peter might be referring to. He put it in the fermenter of one of his IPAs in an effort to drop out the metals there, just trying something different. So it doesn't have to be in the mash.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. Sorry to kind of derail, but it's just
no, but it's not, though, because that's where it gets interesting, and sometimes it's difficult. I can't guess where people want to take the detail, and some of it I don't even have, but it's just wherever people fancy going into the detail of it, let's do it, because it just makes more sense to me doing it here than at the end. So no, not at all.
And well, since we're on the slide and it says pH, is there a noticeable pH impact from the acid addition? Or is it just too small to even really matter?
Oh, I see what you mean for the pomegranate. So the what I was going to say on pH and mash hopping is that if you're going to do mash hopping instead of pomegranate, it's best done whilst the pH is relatively high before you put your acids in. So I've played around a bit with putting the mash hops in, leaving it 5 minutes to do its thing, because chillation apparently is fast, and then adding my acids. And at that point, brewer's friend, the amount of acid it's suggested adding has not brought the pH down as much as predicted. So it sort of becomes a bit less accurate. So I prefer the pomegranate. Have I noticed it going too low with it? No, not at all.
Well, I imagine the brewer's friend, I haven't used the calculator specifically, but obviously adding mash to anything that will increase your pH, right? So I imagine with mash hopping, the pH calculators wouldn't be accurate in the first place.
Fair enough. Yeah, that would have put. I mean, you're only adding 30 grams though. I know for that example I gave earlier, I was being heavy-handed there, but even when you only had sort of 30 grams. But yeah, fair enough. That probably
but if you think about dry hopping, right, you have
yeah.
beer finishing at 4.2, and then you put a dry hop charge, and all of a sudden you're at 4.6, and you need to bring it back down with acid, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, very true. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that actually. Very true. So, but I certainly haven't noticed the pomegranate acting in the opposite direction. So yes, I will at this point measure for pH. I'm normally aiming for about 5.2 because I find for me, yeah, we go. I find if I hit 5.2 in the mash, I'm less likely to then overshoot at the end of the beer. And a bit like you were referring to, Serge, those higher pHs I find make the beers taste sort of quite flabby, bit dull. I get sort of a sort of earthiness, and I find especially with double IPAs, they give the beer a really rough bitterness. The bit it just yeah, not very pleasant. The moment you bring the pH back down, so just off the top of my head, I've ended up at like 4.6, like you say, for a dipper. If I bring it down to 4.2, the taste difference is just absolutely ridiculous. The rough bitterness is completely smoothed off, and the whole beer tastes livelier and fresher and perkier. And yeah, the two are night and day. If you drop it down further towards, let's say, 4.2, very quickly it loses its punch, and the whole beer starts tasting, I don't know, how do I describe it? It starts tasting like a pale ale almost.
Yeah, it's something that I've played around with as well. I can't say I adjust too frequently. I don't really brew hoppy style, so most of the time it's not important, at least for me. But also when we went to Beak, I noted that they usually adjust the final pH of their hoppy beers to 4.3 pretty much religiously. I think that the head brewer went into some beers we do, 4.28, some 4.29, but I don't none of us have equipment precise enough to to really do that. But 4.3 is what they're aiming for, and they only really make hobby beers.
Yeah. I think the important thing to do is the way I do it. I don't have a picture of it there. Maybe I do later on. The way I do it is I'll pour a test glass, and I'll stick the probe in that, and it's basically at this point it's cold and it's carbonated, so the pH is not going to be the same. It's going to be lower, isn't it? Because it's carbonated. It's not going to be the same as the post fermentation. But again, it's all about relativity. And then I'll take another glass and I will dose it with a tiny amount of acid. I'll move the probe over and use it as a stirrer whilst I add tiny amounts of acid to bring the pH down by maybe a point at a time, from 4.6 to 4.5. And then I'll have a little sip and go from there. And like I say, you definitely, you can see the sweet spot in your rear view mirror as the beer goes from being rough to sort of smoothing out and hitting the sweet spot, and then after that it loses its punch. It starts tasting like a pale ale, and then after that you start tasting the slight acidity to it, which equally is wrong as well. But yeah, it's a great way to liven up a hoppy beer.
Yeah.
That's
less... But we have to go with a disclaimer here. Be bloody careful while adding acid to what is a small amount of beer. And also, as I have found one time when I chucked 30 liters of Helles out, do not try to eyeball it.
Just with a bottle.
Have a specific amount of beer that you know precisely the volume of, and specific amount of acid you add to that, and scale it from there. Every beer is different. Every beer will have a different buffering potential. Once I just eyeballed it, and I ended up with what was basically a sour Helles. It was undrinkable. It went straight down the drain because I dosed it right into the fermenter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? You can, so obviously I'll do it for a glass, and I think usually that ends up being, I don't know, 300 mil or 400 mil. And then when I scale it up, if anything, I'll knock a tiny bit off, and then
Yeah.
I'll taste it again a few days later, because you can always add more. But yeah, as you found, you certainly can't add less after.
I've done exactly the same thing with lagers. Actually, had several kegs of different ones, measured the pH, and found somewhere like 4.7, 4.5, or whatever, and then tried to get them to, say, for example, 4.3 or 4.2 to get that crispness that you want from a lager. And it makes a huge noticeable difference going from a flabby end through to the lactic twang end when you've added a little bit too much. But then you're absolutely right. If you measure it right with a known quantity, blah 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 blah, do your maths first. It really makes a difference, and it saved a couple of beers, I think, from going down the bath.
So can we say 4.3 is most likely your happy spot? Like if you've got a hoppy beer or a lager, is 4.3 a good target in general?
For a double IPA and IPA, I found 4.4 for the
4.4.
technique you described. If I go, that's probably the sweet spot, because you want, after that, for me, I mean, a double IPA should have a punch to it. You know, it should be smooth, I think, ideally, but it should hit you. And after that, like I said, it starts to lose its, it starts tasting like a different beer entirely.
Yeah.
And
So
then
like
on the
4.4 for a hoppy beer and 4.2 for a lager, because when a lager is 4.4, it just doesn't have the crispness of flavor at all.
yeah.
So Ian, are you adding the phosphoric after in the fermenter if you need to adjust, or are you adjusting it back at mash?
No, sorry, this is where are we? Okay, so we've ended up in this discussion because I was saying I aimed 5.2 in the mash in an attempt to get to a better final pH.
Yeah.
I do these pH adjustments when, so I keg the beer, I carb it up, I give it a week, let's say, and then I taste it, because I just, for me, these, and again, I deal with them later on in the presentation, but these sort of, it's one of the finished beer adjustments that I'll make rather than as I go along.
Right.
So I mean, I'll do it once and I'll do it at the end and to taste at that point, because for starters, I suppose I have, and yeah, maybe this is what Sturge referring to. I have heard of brewers, I suppose, doctoring the beer as it goes through the process if it's not the right pH. You know, again, I'm at the base, I try and keep things simple, and for me, I do it to taste at the end. I'm not going to start tasting stuff out of the fermenter and start saying, well, I'd expect the half fermented wort to taste a bit, you know. Yeah, I don't. And also, I haven't heard of, although I guess if brewers are doing it, maybe there are reasons. I haven't necessarily heard of a good reason to do it, let's say, mid fermentation. You know, for a particular result.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah. I've just heard of some people adjusting it in the fermenter. You know, when as it goes into the fermenter, they're checking the pH then, and then adjusting at that.
Well, there are different reasons. Like I think adjusting pH for different points of a new brew process. It's something you do for different reasons. So adjusting at the end. So I don't keg. So you know all of my beer goes into cans these days. So I can't do what Ian does, even though that's what I would promote. Let the beer condition and achieve its final form as it does, and then adjust accordingly. If you can just inject some acid into a keg, shake it about, good stuff. I would make those adjustments infrequently, but I would make them at the end of fermentation, once the beer has finished distill rest and it's basically the point of maturation, and then either shake the fermenter or just leave it for a week or two. It will disperse the acid eventually. Adjusting your pH, let's say after your boil is finished, before it starts fermenting, can be advantageous, but that really depends on what kind of beer, etc. Like, you know, a classic example, any beer that has any lactobacillus in it, you want to bring the starting pH below 4.5 so that the lacto doesn't eat through all the head forming compounds. That's an example of a reason. You could also adjust pH, as I'm probably about to do just now after mashing. I want to see what it is so that my boil happens around 5.2, 5.3, so that all the proteins ultimately.
I mean, I assume that yeast, though, most yeasts, finding the perfect pH for those is a relatively easy process to find out. So I was just wondering whether anyone was, adjusting the pH in the fermenter to suit whatever the yeast wanted, rather than the final beer taste. Which, obviously, if you're after that, you might want to do that further down the line.
Can't say I've come across anybody adjusting pH during fermentation. It's kind of either before it starts or afterwards. But
I meant before it started. Yeah.
Before for sour.
It would be too presumably difficult to do it during because of knowing exactly what's going on at that stage in the fermentation process. I assume the pH. Well, the pH does change.
The pH is going to drop during fermentation.
Yeah. So knowing where it is in that dropping,
advocate of doing things at the front end, which seems to be what Ian's doing. I think it's more important to get your mash profile right than the downstream stuff, because you're playing catch up after that, aren't you? Really?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
for sure. I think the only time that you want to start thinking about this, until you've nailed everything else, is if you are reusing the yeast to multiple generations, because as the yeast gets more and more tired, usually if it doesn't have enough nutrients, the finishing pH of the beer will start creeping up. So you might imagine lager yeast will finish at, call it 4.2. Maybe the next brew, it's a bit more tired, will finish 4.3 and then 4.4, etc., and it starts affecting your flavor profile.
Just a quick finish one, maybe on that one. If anyone remembers the DIY dog PDF that the Brewdog sent around, or like released in like 2017, and every so often updated it, which was basically all of their recipes given away with all the info on it, all the stats. I remember looking at that at the time, and I've just opened the one from like 2017, and the pHs for almost all of the beers are 4.4, the couple of 4.3s. So they had already nailed that needs to be the final kind of pH. I'm just flicking through them. So that is like a 5 a.m. Saint, if anyone remembers that, 4.4. They're all, I mean, all the famous ones are in there, all the big ones, they're all the same, 4.4. And a couple of lagers, 4.3. I can see Nanny State, even the non-alcoholic one, 4.4.
And a bit like Sergio said, you almost can't, if you're doing a decent dry hop, you're almost, I can't really see sometimes how you're going to hit that number unless you're adjusting afterwards, because it has such a huge effect on the pH as soon as you dry hop.
Pushes it back up.
Yeah.
I guess you just have some dry hop and some lactic acid at that point when you dry hop, maybe, I don't know.
One thing I do actually, and this is a silly little foible. I don't know what it is. Anyway, I've played around with lots of different methods of chilling my samples for both pH and for gravity. And the fastest and easiest way I found is I take a 2-litre steel jug, you can see in the middle photo there, and pop in my sample amount, no more. And then I take a cold water bath, a bit like you do for a starter, chill a starter, and shuffle the jug around in it. And I mean, within about 10 seconds, you're there for a pH sample. And obviously a gravity sample is an awful lot more, but within a minute or so, especially if you refresh the cold water, you're there. So that's the fastest way I found of getting wort down to a hydrometer temperature. Right, mash.
Just going to want to add to what Ian said there. My method of doing the same thing is to use one of those, like a sort of rectangular sushi dishes, like a cool ship. Just like
Oh.
pour the wort in there, and it cools down incredibly quickly, and then just chuck it back in the jug, and then pour it into my test tube or whatever I'm going to take my pH sample into.
Yeah,
Like a big
one thing to do to make sure that you're measuring the actual pH of your actual wort is to rinse the container that you're going to be putting it in with wort empty, and then fill up again. Because depending on the amount of residue of potentially dried up water in a small enough sample, it will matter.
Oh, I see. Yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, even the residue dried around the, yeah, okay.
Not wet on.
Blimey. Yeah. Oh, surge. Not gonna sleep.
Yeah, those pH probes on that meter, I have that exact one. They are incredibly sensitive to any kind of variation.
In what sense, Ken?
Well, like any kind of accidental dilution with other, with
Okay.
a bit of a droplet of tap water, or you've still got a droplet of deionized water on there, or a little bit of work from the previous sample. You know, I end up rinsing the thing in about 3 different solutions, shaking it all off, and then putting it in, and then going, no, that doesn't look right, and then going and recalibrating the bloody thing, and then coming back again.
Yeah, I had similar issues for a long time, and then until I got a protocol of kind of like, okay, you put it in one of the buffers for calibrating it, and then squirt the buffer off with some distilled water, pat it dry, potentially do that again, and then you can move it on to the next thing. Because otherwise, carrying across like the any residue of buffer into anything else was just like, yeah, it was the sample would be miles off.
No, you have to rinse the probe with distilled or deionized every time.
Yeah.
But of course, you've got to remember, because it's a logarithmic scale, 7 to 6 or 7 to 8 is a small amount. As you go away from that, the amount that you have to make a change is much larger, with it being logarithmic. So what I'm saying is that the difference between 6 and 7 is a very, very close thing, and can be offset by the tiniest amount. So when you're measuring, say, sparge water pH, it's so close to 7 that the tiniest amount of acid in that will chuck it down to 6 or 5. Getting 5 down to 4 is a hell of a job. You know, getting pH 4 down to 3, you're putting masses more acid. Well, you're putting 10 times each time you go down a unit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's important to remember that. You know, it's very easy to get a difference between, say, 6 and 7, or 7 or 8 or whatever.
And in fact, I just on that note, Jerome, I use your excellent presentation, if I may say so, to recalibrate my probes a lot more often than I used to do. So yeah, that was super useful. Actually, I enjoyed that. So just moving along to the rest of the mash. So I have been, well, occasionally, well, no, actually more and more now for my lagers, I do a Gallagher mash, but I'm not quite as dedicated as Rob is. And so I've been working on this technique, which I call a monocoction, which is where I very lazily take out up to 90% of the grain as a thick mash, and boil it for 20 minutes before chucking it back in, rather than doing single, double, triple, or whatever. My impression is of this technique is it gets you some way there, but I think I'm hoping to refine it by starting with about 80% of the grain out and boiling it for maybe 15 minutes, and then putting half of it back in, and then boiling the rest for another 15, just to get a bit more complexity out of the decoction, but again, without necessarily having to pull twice. I don't know. Is it heresy, Rob? I think Rob's logged off. He's in disgust, clearly.
He's gone.
He's gone. At this point, I'll also then look at overnight. Oh, no, that's not that one. At overnight mashing. So I do a couple of different things here. I will either stop the mash, stop the mash at about 65 degrees, and insulate it, and then just leave it overnight, which is brilliant for high ABV beers or high attenuation beers like saisons. So I do it a lot for my barley wines. I do a lot of overnight mashing. The other thing you can do for beers that aren't going to be that strong is to sparge them and then heat the worts to, let's say, 75 degrees and then insulate them overnight. So you still get the benefits of splitting the brew day, but it stops standard strength beers over attenuating, which I've had before. But in both cases, you need to be careful that the mash doesn't drop below 55 degrees. So you've really got to wrap it up well so you don't get anything lactic going on in it. When I sparge, sometimes I find Beersmith and softwares I don't know whether it's just on my all-in-one system, but will overestimate the amount of water I need. So I sometimes hold a couple of liters back because I much prefer to liquor back a brew than for a brew not to hit the numbers or to be too low on the numbers and then need to think about doing something else. I don't like adding sugar to most beers. I find it thinning. I don't like adding DME because I find it a bit cloying and biscuity and slightly plastic, unless it's a big imperial recipe, in which case it just gets lost in all the other flavors. And obviously boiling off is a bit, painstaking. So I prefer to be too high and then liquor back. But at the end of the mash, yes, I will do the usual gravity checks and get the beer get the beer to where it's going to boil, and then I will, if necessarily, revise hop calculations. So even a difference. So this is an example of. So this is that double IPA recipe from earlier. So 26.5 litre batch, and I'm aiming for, let's say, 93 IBUs. Even a 3 litre difference, I say even, I would have had instances where, I might have ended up with maybe 3 litres more and your IBUs are immediately down by 5. Now, again, they're approximate numbers, but if you're doing an iteration and it's relative, they're numbers that you may well end up perceiving, especially as it could be lower than that. So I'll, at that point, with my recipe, go back into the software and readjust the hops, usually the bittering, just to keep things simple, just to make sure I'm going to get the IBUs that I want out of the recipe. Again, all in the name of trying to make sure that for that iteration, I'm as close to where I'm aiming as possible. Right. How are we doing for time, by the way, Jay? Am I well over, or lost completely?
Well, it's 9 o'clock. Myself, I'm still good to go. How's everyone else? I don't think we put a time limit on these things. Feel free
We're
to.
fine.
Yep.
Thinking I'm sure the rest of it we can wrap up in half an hour or so. If I don't want anyone falling asleep. Maybe I should.
I don't think that's happening.
Generated lots of discussion, I think.
If I see anyone in sleeping bags, I'll understand. Right, so then I'll move on to the boil. Like I say, I use a hop spider, and the first thing I do is I'll dump the recirculation arm from the all-in-one, from the Brewzilla, from the pump into the spider, and I'll pump around a bit and stir, especially to do gravity measurements, and then, give or take, by the time it gets even close to boiling, that's usually, I don't know, say 20 minutes or whatever it's been going round, maybe more sometimes. And at that point, I'll pull the spider out and I will get rid of what you can see in the photo there, which is all the bits of grain that have been moved around and really that I don't want in the boil at that stage. And sometimes, as you can see in that photo, even on a reasonably small batch, it can be quite a fistful of grain. Yeah, which I don't like the look of. I would say actually, when I had the 3-vessel system, the wort that was going into the kettle would be crystal clear. Now it's pea soup, but I've not noticed any difference. I don't think. Yeah, I'm not going to get too precious about that. That's all fine. As I approach the boil, I'll turn off the pump at about maybe 95 degrees. And this is to avoid air bubbles getting into the pump, which means that the impeller can overheat and swell up. And I've had this on a bunch of pumps before, and you end up having to buy spares, which are not expensive, but it's annoying. And you can tell because the impeller starts to swell. Probably even got some actually. And then I'll blow back through the recirculation hose and turn off the valve in order to try and get rid of as much unboiled wort from the system as possible, so that it's all being boiled. And I'll sort of hang the hose, or sort of prop the hose up on the side of the system, because obviously you're not recirculating during the boil. And then what? So at that point, usually on to the 60-minute edition. 60 minutes. If I'm using flex for something like that double APA recipe, I'll weigh it out into a steel spoon with a bit of foil just to catch anything that goes wrong. So I'll weigh out the number of grams I need, and then I'll simply add it by stirring the spoon, as you can see in the second photo, into the boil. So flex is pretty easy to add in. And then I'll work through the rest of the hop additions. At 10 minutes, I tend to save up all of my brewing salts, yeast nutrient, and Protafloc, Whirlfloc, and add them all in one go, just to simplify things. And in fact, at the beginning of the boil, I should have said the first thing I put in as well is the chiller, because then it's just all done. So again, it just simplifies the process a bit more. I've tried using the granular version of Protafloc. That seemed like a good idea, especially as you can sort of weigh it out based on your batch size. But I found that as it got a bit older, it would form tiny little jelly balls and they would block the pump. So I stopped using that, went back to Camden tablets, not Camden tablets, tablet versions of Whirlfloc, Protafloc.
Sorry, did I understand you correctly that you use both Protafloc and Whirlfloc as well? Or
no, sorry, I just use both names so that people know what I'm talking about. No, only one. I think it's mainly Protafloc here, or is it mainly Whirlfloc here? I can't even remember. You buy the stuff and then put it on the shelf and forget about it.
So those jelly balls, that was from old powder. I used to get that. I used to have them like little marbles all in the bottom of the kettle.
Yeah, it was the only thing, and I think I even experimented in the end, switching between the two of them just to be absolutely sure, and it definitely was. And the pumps, the all-in-one systems, with my old system, the 3-vessel with the big pumps, they'll chew through anything, pellets, the lot, they don't really care. But on these smaller systems, it takes much less to block them. So yeah, funny looking things like tapioca or something, weren't they?
Yeah, very odd.
Tastes
like
awful.
Massive couscous.
Yeah. So yeah, where are we? So at that point, I'll dump obviously we'll come off the boil, I'll chill to 80, and I'll pop the recirculation hose back into the spider, so it's effectively stirring the whirlpool additions throughout. At this point, where we are, so at this point in a fresh hop English IPA, apart from the bittering hop, the only thing going into that recipe that I use is the fresh hops at this point. And I use one of these, what are they? It's a grain bag. It's a boilable grain bag that I've got with one or other system that I bought in the past. I got a couple of these, but they're easy enough to buy, I think. And so I just dump them all into the bag and then sort of push them down. This is the fresh hops. And yeah, they sort of very quickly turn to sort of vegetal mush, which you can stir around for the whirlpool. I've also played around quite a bit with using incognito here to bolster up the hop layering in IPAs. And the easiest way I found to do that is to take a teeny Pyrex jug. I think this one's 250 ml or something, and again weigh out, squeeze out the little bit of incognito that you're going to use, or the whole pack, and then basically just dunk the jug into the whirlpool and mix it up like that, because it can be tricky to add some of this stuff. I also, being a bit of a skinflint, I've also found that the old school versions of incognito, like Cascade, are often much cheaper than the fancier versions, and they're quite often on sale. So I think I bought a whole load of Chinook from Malt Miller a while ago from like £3 a pack or something stupid, rather than the 11 or something that Citra or what it sells for. So you can quite often get hold of that quite economically, and if you're putting lots and lots of hops in the beer, it allows you to cut back a bit on the vegetal matter. Once the whirlpool is finished, photo of it? No, I haven't, so don't worry about that. But once the whirlpool is finished, I'll pull up the spider and I'll actually press that out. At that point, it's 80 degrees, and I make sure I use clean gloves, blah blah. But there's so much lovely liquid stored up in those hops that I can't resist, using the spider as a bit of a press and getting every last drop out, which again reduces your liquid losses as well.
Do you hop sparge?
Do I hop sparge? No.
Well, you're missing a trick there, I think.
What's that, Peter?
Well, if you put, because of I've had this trouble with fresh hops as well. They just absorb so much wort. So when you lift them up, if you put some, a jug of boiling water and just put, say, a litre of boiling water through it, you will get the goodness out, and then you give them a squeeze.
Fair enough. No, not done that. I do, with that bag, actually reminds me, when you lift it up, I mean, obviously it's quite long, and you can twist it and really wring it out, really get it wrung out. But no, I haven't dumped them in. A good idea, I like that. At this point, where are we? At this point, yes, I'll chill. I use an immersion chiller. Yeah, you can see it in the photo there. Mainly for ease, and I only do sub 50 litre batches, so it's very capable of that. But also, I'm very, very wary of, I just have an innate fear of chilled wort going through anything that I can't get a brush inside or pressure cook. Every time I pull the taps off my kegerator, despite regular purple line cleaner, they're always slimy inside. So yeah, I worry about other types of chillers. Once I've got it down to pitching temp, I'll either connect it to, you can see in that photo there, I either connect it to the blow-off tube in the conical and spray it in the top to oxygenate it. Or I sort of jet it in. A picture of, I jet it into the, if it's, I'm using a flat bottom fermenter, I'll sort of jet it into there to get as much water as possible. If I'm transferring it to the flat bottom fermenter there, I will let it settle in the all-in-one system for, I don't know, 30 minutes, then transfer it and leave some in the bottom. If it's going into the conical, I'll just jet the whole lot in and then dump a litre later. Not that worried about trub. But I definitely want to see, taking a step back, we'll always want to see that there's been a decent hot and cold break. Which takes us on to fermentation. Yeah, so beginning of brew day, I'll always put all of my fermenter bits that I can into the pressure cooker and give them a damn good pressure cooking before dumping them into Starsan. Reference Steve's excellent cleaning presentation. Very, very good. Where are we? Let's just make sure I don't miss anything. And I'll stick everything in there that I can get in, transfer hoses, especially the hoses, crikey. Yeah, definitely pressure cook hoses. everything, the fork that I use to stir the yeast if I'm rehydrating, and I'll cook that for 75 minutes before sticking them all into Starsan. That funny little racking arm adaptation there is one that I've had to modify on my conical, because otherwise it hits the door if you try and use the sort of the rotating kit that comes with SS stuff, or did all those years ago, maybe out of date now. Anyway, I just took a silicon bung and cut it down and cut a hole in it so I could stick a racking arm in it, so that when I set the fermenter up, the racking arm's pointing down, and then when I come to rack, stick it up to stop it getting plugged with yeast. Most of my beers are over 1060, so I almost always rehydrate the yeast. I only use oxygen if I'm going over 1075, and in that case, I've got a stone set up on a tri-clamp, which I'll use at the bottom of the conical. I don't use the elbow fitting that comes with the SS conical, because I've had issues with that blocking with dry hop before. So again, this just keeps it a bit simpler. When I've used the boiling stone, when I've used the O2 stone, I'll then boil it for 20 minutes and I'll flush it out with CO2 while it's absolutely hot and steaming, just to help it clean out and dry. Lee Immins showed me a great trick with anti-foam, which I'll also add at this stage if I'm doing a brew that I think might get anywhere near the top of the fermenter. So I just put a few streaks on the lid, which was his little trick, so that it basically only gets used if you need it. If the Krausen gets that high, then great, it uses it, and if not, then it doesn't go anywhere near it. So that's quite a good little tip. Where are we now? I'm getting ahead of myself there. Profiles. What have I done there? With my fermentation profiles, with ales, I'll start at about 15, and then I'll end up somewhere near 22, 24 at the end, just to make sure everything's cleaned up and the yeast is still as vigorous as possible. With lager, where have I got a slide on this? Oh yeah. With lagers, I'll use the fast fermentation technique, where I'll start cold, and then once it's about 50%, I don't know whether you can see the mouse on your screen, but once it's about 50% there, marks out by the green line, I'll then raise the temperature up. Like if I'm starting at 9 to 11, 9, 10 degrees, I'll then raise it up 50% to 13 to 15 degrees. And when I get to 75%, I'll pull it up to 16 or 17 degrees, and finally top out at 18 degrees once it's 90%. The idea being that, again, you're keeping the yeast as active as possible, whilst at the same time avoiding overheating the yeast, so that you don't get esters. And I like that technique for lager brewing. It's sort of, yeah, it seems to be. I've always found my lagers very clean with it, and logically, I like the idea that you're really keeping the yeast, on top form at each stage of fermentation, so that it's cleaning up after itself as quickly as possible. As you can see from the chart, I also use one of those leave-in hydrometers. I've got a little collection of them now, actually, but I'm not interested in the absolute gravity. It's just all relative again. So it's just basic progressive attenuation, because I don't find the numbers that any of them give are spot on, but they're very, very useful to work out where you are in the process. And also then at the end, when it's stabilized, when you've hit absolute gravity, and I'll always leave it there a good few days to make sure it's clean as possible. Just going back, yeah, so dry hops. I normally do a couple of additions with my IPAs. The first, once the initial crazy fermentation has died down, I don't have the equipment to introduce the hops without with just CO2 pushed only, things like the hop bong. I don't have the room in the kegerator to get something like that near the top of it. So I've chopped up a milk bottle or a fruit bottle, and stuck a keg post on it. And what I do is I fill that, the top comes off. You can sort of see the line around the top there. And I fill it with hops and gently push CO2 into it just to flush them out before then dropping them into the fermenter. I'm sure it's only a matter of time before Kegland come knocking for to ask me how on earth I do it and to get a copyright on it, possibly. And then I'll do the same again. Actually, at that point, I'll also, if I'm going to add it, I'll also add Spectrum at that point. Spectrum is, I'm just quickly probably seen this before, but Spectrum is best added a few days into secondary. If you leave it too late, and the extreme of that would be dosing a beer with it, like you would do acid at the end. Not only do you get, I mean, I think they're being a bit charitable there with green resinous notes. I get onion and plasticky onion at that. It's not a very subtle product I don't think, to add to a finished beer, and I find its taste is very, very noticeable. I can pick it out quite easily. But when you use it in secondary, mixed in with all the other hops, it melds. Yeah, it melds very nicely with all the other flavors. Where are we? Yeah. If I'm, I'll then do a second hop addition once I've chilled the beer and dumped the yeast out. And when I do that, again, I'll use my little sort of makeshift hop flusher and flush it with CO2, dump them through the top, and then maybe 2 or 3 times a day, I will rouse them with CO2. You can see the rig I've got on the photo on the left-hand side there, which is just CO2 at about 12 psi being pushed into the bottom of the conical through the butterfly valve. I will always, each time I do that, loosen off the tri-clamp fitting and flush the line with CO2 just to avoid any risk of getting oxygen into the beer at that stage, because obviously it's at its most susceptible to oxidation. And then finally, kegging. So I always strip my kegs down completely. For my money, it doesn't actually take that much time, and I always worry about more than anything, not just stuff getting mist in there, but also cleaner getting mist in there in corners. So stripping them down avoids that risk. And like I said, I don't find it actually takes that much more time. I do an occasional iodine rinse to get rid of anything too wild that might have built up in there. And then I purge all of my kegs, which quite a lot of folk do, fill up with Star San, and push them into another keg. But I just push from one keg to another. I've had it going for a couple of years now. I find that I need to grease the lid seals of my kegs with silicone to make sure that I don't get any sealing issues. And then once they're purged and ready to keg, I'll leave them upside down and I'll flush any leftover sanitation, Star San out through the PRV valve, so it's completely empty. When I'm, oh no, that's on a bit. So that's keg purging. When I do my transfers, sometimes, obviously, if the beer gets, if the wrecking arm has got blocked at all with yeast, I will give it a quick flush with CO2 just to push that out, and then hook up the tubes to do a closed transfer, which you can see here. And the keg at this point is still pressurized. So what I'll do is loosen the tri-clamp fitting to the fermenter, and I'll back flush CO2 through the line that's going to run beer from the fermenter to the keg to make sure, again, there's no oxygen at all in there before then opening it up. A really great trick that someone taught me years ago for making sure that the keg is filled to the right level is to attach a disco and a little blow-off tube to the gas intake and just tilt the keg slightly there. You can see I've just put a little piece of wood underneath it. And what happens is the beer hits it before it would hits it earlier than it would do if you had it upright. And as soon as beer comes spurting out the end, like in that bottom photo, I stop the flow, tilt the keg back up, and the level of the beer drops just below the gas intake, which means that you never get that issue where you get beer pushed back up your gas line anywhere near to any of your gas kit. So that's a really simple way of doing that. Obviously, at this stage, I'll also use gelatin, which I do for any beers that are not going to be, lagered for a long time. So IPAs, English IPAs, all those sort of things, I will squirt in some gelatin at this stage, usually when the keg's about half full, in through the PRV valve. So again, you're pushing air out. And I'll give the keg a gentle rock at that point just to make sure it's nicely mixed. Carbonation, I do over a couple of days at about somewhere between 35 and 40 psi. Once I've got the two kegs, or the one keg hooked up to that, I'll then turn off the gas at the bottle, and I'll come back and revisit it every few hours, sometimes overnight, so you can't help it. And it's quite a nice way of doing it. It has a couple of benefits. One is you never empty a gas bottle if you've got a leak. And the second is if your gas pressure drops down to 0, it means you've got a leak. So yeah, I'd expect it to go from, even overnight, from maybe 40 psi, it will drop down to a minimum of sort of somewhere between 8 or 10 psi. So at that point, it's reached quite close to equilibrium, but everything is still holding gas. I've got manifolds set up. Well, and at this point, if you've got a manifold set up, you can also then do additional checks for leaks. So if it does go down to 0, you can unhook the keg, pressurize up the gas line, and if the manifold drops to 0, obviously at that point you've got a leak on the gas side. You can use a sparge valve, one of the Kegland ones, spunning valve, I guess they market them as, and that will show you whether the keg has sprung a leak, whether you've got a leaky keg. And if it's neither of those, if both of them hold pressure, which I had a couple of weeks ago, it's usually the connection between the gas line and your post. So it's the O-ring that's failed between the two. So I had to replace that, and all was well. But it's a good way of diagnosing leaks on the system without ever risking emptying a gas bottle.
The burst carbonation thing I stole off you a number of years ago. It works really, really well. If you've got a known headspace, so the way that you've tilted your keg, that's the same headspace for every single time. And I do a similar thing. I think I weigh it on a one of those post office scales that I nicked that off James Wilson. So I fill it with like 17 liters or something like that, and give it 40 psi.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, come back every 6 hours, and probably 3 bursts of that will get it around 10 psi at whatever it is, like between 4 and 8 centigrade in the chilling fridge thing, and you're roughly in the right area with the minimum of CO2, and definitely not emptying a bottle, which you only do once or twice.
Sorry, I've got a question here. So are you saying you give it like a single blast of CO2 up to whatever amount you're saying, and then you just disconnect it?
Yeah.
And then as you come back, you watched it drop because it's then theoretically it's been absorbed into the beer. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Right, get you. Because I wasn't quite sure what Ian was saying at first, but now I tend to like leave mine hooked up for a couple of days at like 40 psi, then turn it down to 10 for the rest of the week.
I found that I literally, and I don't know if this is how you do it, Ian, as well. So I've got so the wort's gone straight in, so it's flat, and then I put the gas disconnect on, burst it to like 40, and then just turn the bottle off, and then put it in the fridge. And as you say, it starts to absorb, and then come back in the morning, do it again, and After about three goes, it's good.
But at that point, you're still hooked up to the gas, yeah. But it's just not
closed. No, I literally put the disconnect on.
Take
the disconnect off. Turn the bottom, take the disconnect off.
I leave mine hooked up. I leave mine hooked up, and so I can see. I leave it at 40 psi on the gauge, and then by the time I come back in the morning, that gauge just dropped down to 10.
Okay.
Or if there's a leak somewhere on the system, which is useful, it's dropped down to 0 at that point. And
it's really useful to find that out, actually. And that's a really good side trick. But I have one of those Kegland spunding valves, so every morning or every evening, I just plop that on and see where it's dropped to.
Yeah.
So, okay, in my head now, I know that will need 40 psi for another 12 hours. Disconnect it, come back in 12 hours, and it's absorbed enough for a third final go, kind of thing.
Yeah. And are you keg tilting to do your fill level, or are you using scales?
No, say I nicked James Wilson's idea, which was a post office weighing scales, which takes about 50 kilograms or something like that. So plop the empty keg on it. An empty keg is 4.4 kilos for the little fat ones, and then 4.1 for the tall ones. So you can either then tear it, and then I just fill until it hits 17 kilos, and then turn it off. I haven't done the actual
17. Math. You're leaving so much space in there, Steve.
Yeah, but that's because you've got enough headspace with 40 psi in that you've got enough gas to be able to dissipate in the brew over that time. Because if you leave it like 500 mils space, it'll take you forever to kind of just keep doing it. So I put 17 in the keg, and then 8 of these or something like that on the side with some sugar in, just because, stick them up on the shelf and you get a cask conditioned version, or you know what I mean, like a bottle primed version, to measure up against the keg version.
Old Dave House, he never used to consider a keg to be filled unless the lid got wet when he was putting it on.
Right. The problem I've had with that, though, is if I overfill, because I have that sometimes with those mini kegs, and then you can't carbonate them by force because the surface area is so tiny that they never bloody carbonate.
So this is what I'm saying. So
those mini kegs are particularly notorious because they fill very quickly because of the conical top.
Yeah.
And if there's no headspace, it doesn't matter, because there's also a limit to how you can pressurize those things, because I think the PRV valves with the mini kegs are sort of 30 or something, whereas of course at least with a corny you can take them right up.
Yeah.
The only other way I used to do it, and I stopped doing it for some reason, and I don't know why, because it was quite effective, was to fill it to the top so it was wet, as you say, and then put the gas on, so it was chilled and cold. So I'd put it in the fridge, and then bring it back out, and then it was time to carbonate it. So put the gas on up to something like 40, like a lot, because what I was then do was turn the thing on its side, lay it on the ground with the gas full on, and then basically roll it backwards and forwards, and you could hear the gas bubbling into the liquid. And then I'd kind of turn it down to the right PSI that I knew I wanted, so 15 or something like that. And then after about half an hour, maybe, just rolling your foot on it while you're watching the TV, the bubbles would stop going. And it's not dissimilar to when you put one of those carb caps on one of these, really pump it up, give it a good shake, and you carbonate the beer kind of quite quickly. Just a big version of doing that. So I used to just roll it backwards and forwards. The bubbles would keep going, and then when the bubbles stopped, that was it carbonated enough, and you could then serve it fizzy, like within an hour, kind of thing, of connecting the gas up. It wasn't always like those nice fine bubbles. It was quite spurty, so you'd need to let it settle for a day or something like that, or a few hours or something like that. But there was another way, a way I used to do it, and it worked quite well. But
so put mine in the kegerator.
I ended up not needing to be in a hurry to do it. I got myself more organized probably, or something like that, or less impatient, something. And then learned the burst carbonation thing, which was like, oh, well, this is much easier. Psh, come back in the morning.
I just hook mine up at the pressure I want for the carbonation level and leave it. So I think I'm gonna leave a keg for at least a week anyway to condition a bit.
Yeah.
By that time, it's usually at the level you want.
Yes, the conditioning does then take it like another week, I find as well.
I drink out of the fermenter because I've got a
first on.
an all-rounder. Absolutely. But I seldom would keg anywhere near the 19 litres because I would have sampled 1 or 2 pints, as you say, from the all-rounder, and being able to spund, I can judge my carbonation level pretty well, and would only top up when it's in the serving fridge. So when it's in the keg, so that's another. There's lots of ways of skinning the cat here.
Yeah, absolutely, with carbonation. Yeah, absolutely.
That's the other thing I do is when I'm cold crashing, I'll stick it on like between 5 and 10 psi while it's cold crashing. So usually it's pretty much carbonated by the time I get to keg it anyway.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah.
By the way, that photo top left is just a salutary warning as to why you should always clean out your discos when you've done the transfer, if you're doing closed transfers, because on a hoppy beer, you can get some serious stuff caught in them. So everything gets stripped down and cleaned out between every transfer.
I was going to ask about that. Do you get clogs often with the amount the hop matter?
No.
Through those, right? No. You don't. Right.
They're very rare, and I'm now. I probably take more and more. I find these days I ferment for longer, I chill for longer, I leave in the first surge, so I'm leaving the fermenter for longer, even for a hoppy beer, and I give it plenty of time to compact. I dump stuff out the bottom before I tip the racking arm over. So I suspect that was an example of where I was in a bit of a hurry, and probably too early. But
the other question was, when you're filling the keg with the gelatin, so you said through the PIV valve.
Yeah.
How are you doing that?
So I whip the valve out and drop it in a little jug of Star San, and then the syringe of gelatin I've got already, and it's air free. And in fact, I rarely put the whole syringe anyway. And then because of this filling technique where you've got a blow off tube going in, don't do it without that. I've done that before, and you just end up with a face full of gelatin. And I just squirt it in, and actually sometimes I do it quite vigorously to help mix it, and then give it a bit of a rock around. But definitely the tilted keg is the easiest way of judging keg level. I wonder, Steve, actually, whether you could, if you had a bigger piece of wood, if you see what I mean, a higher angle, you could get to your 17 litres without even bothering with a scale. But
no, for sure. Yeah.
As Peter said, plenty of cats, lots of skins.
Yeah.
Which I think then finally, and we've covered a bunch of this anyway, once it's all kegged up and carbonated, I'll then do any final adjustments. The most common, I would say, would be carbonation. I'm always increasing carbonation, especially for competition entries, because I just think a little bit like the acid adjustment, it really lifts the aroma, lifts the body of the beer. I think it's more likely at a competition where judges are swilling and tiny amounts around, it's more likely to present better. And I'd much rather err on that side than a low carbonation, which I think sells a beer short very quickly.
Yeah.
And then a bit like we said, I'll lower the pH quite often not all the time, but quite often, especially with double IPAs, I find. I'm not going to go back over that. We talked quite a bit about that. I've stopped at this stage using things like Spectrum after the beer's done, because I can, like I say, I can really taste it. And unless I really, really have to, I also try and avoid that pre-isomerized hop extract, because at best I find it a little bit chemically and metallic, and at worst, and I know Ken's had this as well, the stuff smells like used socks, cheesy socks, if once it starts to turn. So I try and avoid that as much as possible. All of my kegs these days, I've switched over to those floating dip tubes. They're just, in terms of pouring clear beer sooner and avoiding blockages, and also moving kegs about, which I do quite a bit of for one reason or another. You don't end up sucking up beer from the bottom. I replace all of the hose though. I get rid of the thin stuff that you get with them, and I replace all with the thicker 6mm hose you can get from the malt miller or various places. And then I use an M20 washer to hang on that, just to give it enough weight to stop pouring issues. Where we go? Oh yeah, all my kegs. I think I'm the only person I know that uses these. There's a system called Ball and Keg, which I think they've gone out of business now, where you had this float inside the keg, and then a little metal ball on the outside, and it means you can see exactly how full all of your kegs are. And I still haven't found a better system, and I know it risks. There's a risk, of course, of you're going to make sure that the floats that go in are meticulously clean. But for me, I just can't stand not knowing how much I've got in a keg. I think I would never sleep, I think, if I didn't know.
Is that in your kegerator then?
Yeah. So sorry. That photo there is one of their promo photos, because it demonstrates how it works. So they're in the keg. The float sits in the keg. You put it in. I put it in before I purge the keg, and then they supply some bigger magnets which pulls the float to the side, and then you swap the magnet over for the little steel ball, which is also a magnet. Maybe not steel then, is it? But the little ball is magnetized, and then as the keg level drops, the little ball descends with it. But you can see exactly how much you've got in the keg at all times. I'm really hoping that they invent something better, because they've gone out of business, so I can't get any more of them. I think Kegland come up. Yeah, go on.
Kegland have come out with their laser keg lids that are meant to work. But or back to, like, if you want to take a one-off measurement, then again, postal scales.
Yeah.
Because then you're like, well, yeah, the empty keg's 4.5 kilos, so what's left in here is the number of liters of beer I've got.
Yeah, I think there was someone on the internet who designed some ultrasonic device you could stick in a keg lid that would fire a signal down onto the beer surface and back and measure the amount of beer. It all seemed a bit
sonar or something.
It all seemed a bit over the top. I don't think it went anywhere.
Kegland have produced like keg lids now, which have got like a laser in the lid to do the same thing. And I think they're quite expensive.
Yeah, multiple points.
Yeah, you could get a cheap disto meter if you wanted to do something like that. Probably about 20 quid or something.
Yeah, I can see. I'll be paying for something, because I
think I'll get myself an X-ray machine.
There's also the trick of putting a cold keg in a warm environment and seeing where the condensation goes to.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, when filling, that's how when I fill, because I'm filling from coals because it's been cold crashed. The keg, the level is shown by and it's a pretty good indicator, the cold line.
I've seen somebody take that a step further, and they got like a strip of temperature sensitive, like sticky material that they stuck on the side of their keg, so that would basically, as they fill it, it would change color. So you could actually see where it is there. So
they don't last very long, though, those things.
It was only a bit of paper, so
it wouldn't work in the fridge, would it, either?
No.
Yeah, filling. Well, at some point I probably will end up remortgaging for Kegland, because there's some things I need to know, and that's one of them.
The other option is like, you know, the baggage scales that you can hang your suitcase off. I've got a set of those actually. I find them quite useful for doing quick, large weighing measurements like that.
I've got some of those Plato kegs that I bought ages ago second hand, and they kept on breaking, or a couple of them I couldn't update the firmware, and they just sent me two others as well. So I ended up I've got 5 of them now, but they're all.
Are they the little like you put the keg on them?
Yeah, they're just like little.
And they monitored your consumption, didn't they?
Yeah, so it just weighs it basically. They're just scales, but they're I think they're turning the servers off. Fairly soon.
Yeah.
You
So
can
I have to do something else. Pen and paper.
Use the Raspberry from your Pico.
Sorry?
You can use the Raspberry Pi from your Pico to connect to it.
Yes.
Any of those knocking about? I think that's probably most of what I had to say done. Actually, I was just going to mention a couple of other things, but they're not. I think given the time, we'll leave them. So, yeah, I was going to mention manifolds.
I'm intrigued now as to what they were.
Oh, well, I haven't saved the best for last. God, I built that up, haven't I? Now I really regret it. Well, I was going to just say a note about, we've talked about kegerators quite a bit, but these rows of manifolds you can get, I've found are a very, very cost-effective way. Obviously, they have to be at the same pressure, but here I've got 2 lines of 4. Each one I keep at sort of US pressure and one at UK pressure. And they've each got non-return valves in already, and they're a very cost-effective way of splitting up gas for kegerators, along with these super reliable ODL style regulators that doing the heavy lifting work off the keg. I think they're super useful, and like we were saying earlier, with the non-return valves, they're a very good way of checking leaks and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was probably one of the last things. Oh yeah, and then you can't see it in the picture, but I could pop a camera on it. But the last thing was just in terms of like beer, the final step of the process. I use a counter pressure Pegas filler to fill all my bottles. I still think they're pretty much the best counter pressure filler around. Much easier to use than the little Kegland handheld thing, and with a slightly overcarbonated beer and a well, you can purge the bottles really, really well. I do about half a dozen purges, and then you can end up putting a cap on top of the foam as they come out. And really, they're very good. They take a bit of getting used to, but they're very good.
Which one was that, Ian? Did you say? What?
What called Pegas, Pegas. It might be Lithuanian or something. Certainly they seem to be in Europe the what's the word? The default counter pressure for like craft beer bars and bottle shops. They have this. You've probably seen the big plastic cages. Sometimes some bottle shops have them. That's Pegas. But yeah, very, very good way of bottle filling for all sorts of things. I use it bottle filling even for things like my barley wines when I'm ready to put them away. And I have not noticed any degradation, even though they're only supposed to be used for a few months for bottling. They're a very good way of filling bottles. Yes, and that's.
And you've got 8 taps, is that right?
Well, I've got on the kegerator, I've got 5 taps.
Okay.
On the kegerator, I've got 5. One of those lines I've got running down to the counter pressure filler, and the other one runs off to. This is a good thing about manifolds. You can just have all these lines set up. So the other line, the top one on the right hand side, runs over to the fermenter for when I'm, chilling and that kind of stuff, or pushing CO2 to rouse hops. I think I've got at the moment. I've got 5 kegs on tap, and I think about another 6 currently pouring. I'm backed up a little actually. I've taken a pause from brewing because I've got too much beer. So hopefully that wasn't too random. But I just tried to pick bits and pieces that I thought, might be slightly different, or yeah, that certainly I find make my brewing, like I say, either easier or help me put out better beers. But yeah, I hope that was useful, folks.
It was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Yeah, really good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah. Very thorough, amazing.
Very good.
So that picture's AI generated, is it?
Nice view.
So
Yeah.
we visiting Chamonix for the beer or for the view?
I can't promise you. Well, yeah, beer. We definitely wouldn't be a beer mecca. We do have just down the valley, though. I don't know whether you've heard of them. There's a brewery in Colorado called Outer Limits. They're in the Rockies, and they have decided to set up their European brewery literally a stone's throw from here. I mean, it's all hoppy hazies, but yes, exactly. For some folks. Yeah, fair enough.
Outer Limits, was it?
Yeah.
Just
Right.
Googling it there.
Now, if you ever fancy a field trip,
Yeah.
yes, my door's always open.
So have you got a definitive example recipe for your English IPA?
The best one I've brewed so far, and I still find this bizarre to this day, is the green hop version that's on the lab wiki. And it's just, and I've now brewed it 3 years in a row. And it's the beer I would expect to be least reproducible or least reliable, but certainly the malt bill for it, I really, really like. I think there's a touch of caramel in there. It's really toasty, and obviously then this is where your iterations come in. You can play around with the hop bill in it. The hop bill is super simple because that is bookending for that. So that just uses a bittering charge at 60 of something, well, in this case, something English. And then whatever you've got growing in the garden dumped in, ideally. And in fact, I've put the measures on there, but I think it works out the equivalent of 6 grams per litre. But obviously for wet hops, that'd be an awful lot more.
Not even dried a little bit. That's straight off the vine.
Literally pick and straight in. And for me, that beer I also find super interesting, like any fresh hop beer, because for the first few weeks, and it's fleeting, for the first few weeks, the flavors are so different. They're sweet and fruity and silky, and then after about a month, it changes to much more traditional hop flavors, and the sort of herbalness comes out, and then it turns into a sort of a normal IPA. But for the first couple of weeks of any fresh hop beer, if they're really properly fresh, I think the flavors are really special. It's such a special brew to do, I think, any fresh hop beer. But yeah.
Ian, what the hell is swine ale malt that you've got listed in this beer?
Swine ale.
Where's that from? That's a good question, Ken. I think it might be Belgian.
I thought you said you went for the single supplier.
Yeah, well, I mean,
except when you don't.
Do as I say.
Ian, which supplier do you use?
Oh God, I try to go for them and as much as possible, only because it's available here, and a lot of the breweries use it here. Well, that's my base malt, and then for specialty malts, Thomas Fawcett for pale, Crisp for what is it, sort of for their medium crystal. But to be honest, it's my point was, which Ken has completely undermined now. So long as you stick with one, then your iterations, one brew you might, too much crystal in that, too cloying, so then you back off. But the important thing is not to do what I was doing 5 years ago and I'll try this crystal out there and that looks different, or blend 3 of them together. And I was just I was struggling to iterate.
Yeah.
I know what you mean. I've gradually sort of narrowed down the malts I like to use. They're not necessarily from one supplier, but funnily enough, quite a lot of them are Weyermann malts, like the Barker Munich and the Ericleia Pilsner. Like they're my go-tos now. The Simpsons Maris Otter as well. A few others. Red Rye Crystal. That's awesome.
Is that Simpsons?
Yes.
Yeah. I had my last bottle of rye, those rye beers that we brewed for the Hazen branch. I had my last one last night, actually. It weathered fairly well. That was an interesting grain. That was a funny tasting. But yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ian. I think that was so thorough. I don't think we've ever done a presentation where we discussed every single brewing process. Quite quite amazing in 2.5 hours. I think this was really, really good.
No, very good, very interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Fantastic.
No idea I'd been waffling for that long. I looked at the time halfway through and I couldn't even work out. We're an hour ahead. I was like, what time did we start? What time is it in the UK? Yes.
Be thirsty.
My favourite thing about that image that you've got up there is the fact that the image looks real, but it's the glass of beer that looks AI.
Yeah.
The foam's trying to match the mountains in the background.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The foam, the shape of the foam is the shape of the mountains.
See what he's done there. Not just foam together.
Brilliant. I'm going to go.
Right.
Thank you very much, Ian. We'll see you later.
Pleasure.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you, Ian.
I'm off for breakfast. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Peter.
Yeah, I should probably go and pay some more attention to my beer as well.
Good to see you, Peter.